My name is Ben White, and I'm moderating the session now. And I'm a journalist and a staff writer at Middle East Monitor, the author of a couple of books on Palestine. That's all you need to know about me for now. And we're going to have, hopefully, 3 presentations of about 10 minutes each. And we've got the topic, can political Islam live side by side with secularism? So 3 10-minute presentations, or 2 as it would appear so far. And then there'll be a time for discussion. I'll be reminding the speakers halfway through that they've got halfway through their allotted time. And we're lucky enough to have distinguished guests with us to share their own expertise and analysis. We're going to start off with a contribution from Dr. Maria Holt. She is a reader in politics at the University of Westminster, teaches Middle Eastern politics, and her research interests include gender and conflict in the Arab world, violence against women in the Middle East, and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Her most recent publications are Women and Conflict in the Middle East, Palestinian Refugees and the Response to Violence, and Women, Islam and Resistance in the Arab World. So I'm going to hand her over this microphone because it's being all recorded. You just clip that on anywhere, really.
All right.
And this is already on.
Oh.
Just probably clip it on this.
Right, so shall I can you all hear me? Excellent. All right. So the question is, the question I was asked to think about was, can political Islam live side by side with secularism? And I thought, to start off with, that's fairly straightforward. But then I started to think harder about it, and I decided we need to, first of all, define what we're talking about. Obviously, define the main terms, political Islam and secularism, which I think actually are extremely complex. Obviously, that's what this conference is about. They're very complex terms, and also very contested terms. So there's debates around these sorts of terms, and I realise there are far too many variables to comfortably or easily consider in a really short presentation. So I just want to raise a few points for maybe a broader discussion between all of us. So first of all, we have to think about definitions of secularism, and not only a straightforward definition. I guess we all know what it means, but also how it's been manipulated to serve particular views of the world. And secondly, any understanding of political Islam depends on its context. Conditions, for example, in Egypt, in Turkey, elsewhere, are different. And third, we have to ask, is the domain of politics, by definition, always secular? Why is secularism so often reduced to a kind of offence against religion? So in the 20th century, many people, and I'm talking especially in the West, believed that the secularization of the state system and society would diminish conflicts between religious groups. In the post-colonial Middle East, the emergence of the state system and systems were put in place that attempted to minimize the role of religion. Nationalism, secular nationalism, became the kind of rallying cry as fragmented societies sought and worked to create workable governments. Secular nationalism was both a response to Western modernity, and also it became a kind of umbrella under which very disparate and diverse communities could come to create a new shared identity. But in the Middle East, these sorts of efforts, as we've seen, were not entirely successful. They resulted in largely authoritarian regimes which were unrepresentative of their people. And then eventually, with the defeat of the Arabs by Israel in 1967, all of this threw into question these sorts of claims of nationalism. And many people in the Arab region started to search for alternative ways of expressing their needs and entitlements. This came to be articulated by various forms of a politicized form of Islam. We also have the Islamic modernist movement that emerged in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, mainly around Cairo. And that represented, really hard work and efforts by various Muslim scholars to address these kind of Western modernizing trends that were entering the region in both negative but also, in some cases, positive forms. There was a widespread belief that Islam could rise to the challenge of unity presented in nationalism, and at the same time provide a sense of identity that transcended national boundaries and protected its adherents. And this was promoted by the Islamic modernist movement. And it was seen that the challenge for the Muslim community was, according to modernists, to offer a viable alternative to the dominance of the West. So there was an emphasis, if we can talk in terms of a pan-Arab, pan-Islamist movement, there was an emphasis on unity and also on reform. And this did find many supporters throughout the region. So we can observe a kind of tension between attempts to reform and to modernize Islam, but set against that, the presence of a technologically superior and politically dominant West. So following the decline of Arab nationalism, a movement emerged that could be specifically defined as an expression of a politically engaged form of Islam. The term political Islam, as Charles Hirschkin remarks, has been adopted as a way of identifying the spread of Islamic religion beyond the realm of personal piety and into politics, seen as a secular domain. The domain of politics is seen as secular. Yet, he asks, in what way does this distinction between the political and non-political domains of social life hold today? Raymond Hinnebusch argues that with the decline of the secular ideologies and given the absence of effective channels of legitimate political activity, the call of a new generation of politicized preachers and activists who are often funded through Saudi Arabia or inspired by the revolutionary Islamic Republic of Iran, found fertile ground in many areas of Muslim life, on university campuses, in the mosque and the marketplace and so on. So from this perspective, political Islam represents an appealing alternative to secularism, suggesting that two cannot exist. So, thank you. Various definitions of political Islam, Islamic revival, and the various other terms that are used. For example, it's been described as an increasing political activism in the name of Islam by governments and opposing groups alike. Esposito calls it a potent global force in Muslim politics. It appeals to many Muslims because it appears to offer greater authenticity and self-respect, the calls for dignity and freedom of expression that we talked about. It's developed in a whole variety of different ways, obviously from the apparent accommodation with secular democracy to calls for jihad and the overthrowing of what are regarded as illegitimate regimes. Today, it is a broad tent. Islamism, in the words of an Economist article, comes in many colors, from the black of Al-Qaeda to the dark green of Saudi-style Wahhabism to the palest of modernizing shades. So the next question, I guess, to explore is what do we mean by secularism? So it can be understood in two ways. First of all, as a separation of religion from issues of the state or the domain of politics. And second, there's the increasing differentiation of society into separate spheres, of which religion is just one part. So we have a notion of a community of shared values that can be secured in a modern democratic society through secularism. Although I think, here again, this notion of a community of shared values is a kind of problematic concept. But secularism appears to be linked to grand narratives of modernity, but in other contexts, specifically non-Western contexts and in Muslim contexts, it's expected to be a marginal element. Again, we heard about the Turkish example already. We listened to a speaker talking about the Turkish case, where we can see that secularism in Turkey played a very large role in nation-state building after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. But it's also penetrated into all areas of life through the civil and military elite, and even into civil society organizations. We also now see a government in Turkey described as moderate Islamist, so offering apparently a model in which the two can coexist. Elsewhere, differently, some Islamist activists are arguing for the promulgation of Sharia law, and so here it becomes, again, problematic to separate religion and the state. So relegating religion to a private, a moral sphere is again questionable. Saba Mahmood she argues that contrary to normative understandings of secularism today, its force seems to reside not in neutralizing the space of politics from religion, but in producing a particular kind of religious subject who is compatible with the rationality and exercise of liberal political rule. And so what she's talking about in particular is what she calls the US imperial project. And this came obviously after the events of 9/11, 2001. And the US set about reforming the Muslim world. She describes this as the ideological arm of an otherwise military campaign. And she suggests that the political solution offered by the doctrine of secularism resides not so much in the separation of state and religion, but in the kind of subjectivity that a secular culture authorizes. In other words, for the goal of securing domination over Muslim lands, the US now is trying to remake the world in a singular image. Thus, the notion of secularism, whatever it means, becomes dangerous and is rejected. As we can see, this is a very polarized debate. Political Islam on the one hand, secularism, whatever they mean, on the other hand. And Islam, under that argument, is viewed as a threat to the perceived norms of secular liberal polity. But this assumes that as a political movement, Islamists seek to capture the state. And we had in the 1990s, an Algerian, Salah Chouaki, he said, the state embarks on a course of one-upmanship, beginning a competition with parties that exploit religion and use it for reactionary political ends. The state, aligned with modernist forces, he warns, will lose the battle, since there is an unresolvable contradiction between support for the idea of a modern society and the belief that it is possible to domesticate the totalitarian monster of fundamentalism. So to conclude very, very quickly, so there appears to be an agreement here between the Algerian reformer Chouaki and what Mahmoud calls the US imperial project. And the threat both seem to be identifying is the totalitarian monster of fundamentalism. So secularism, in this sense, really fails, I think, to address this question adequately. So I'll end at that point. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Dr. Holt for her presentation. Unfortunately, I was informed just as she was beginning that Dr. Madawi Rashid is unable to attend the session this afternoon. So we're going to move straight on to Jeremy Corbyn. I'm sure many people here know him in one shape or form. Jeremy Corbyn MP is a British Labour Party politician who's been the Member of Parliament for Islington North since 1983. He's been a member of the Socialist Campaign Group and a long-time supporter of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, where he's a vice chair. He fiercely opposed the Iraq War and has been a prominent campaigner against the Gaza-Israel conflict. He is an elected member of the Stop War Coalition Steering Committee. Thanks very much.
Ben, thank you very much, and thank you for organising this conference. I'm in the same shape or form I always am, so don't worry about that. And it's nice to have you moderating our session. The question, can Islam live with secularism, or political Islam live with secularism? The short answer is yes, of course it can. And I think we should work on the basis that in any pluralistic society there has to be a very big degree of acceptance, understanding and space for people of all faiths in order to be able to live together. There is a number of quite serious misconceptions about British history, and Britain as a country is the most adept at practicing self-delusion of anyone in the world. I realise that the heights to which this self-delusion has got to when David Cameron told Parliament on one occasion that Britain had led the way in abolishing the slave trade. Britain led the way in establishing the slave trade, and only very much later reached the position that slavery was immoral and wrong and should be ended. That's just one example of it. But on the question of religion, religious tolerance and acceptance, if somebody said to you, do you live in a Christian country or a secular country in Britain today, I'm not sure what the answer would be from the majority of people. They might say they are Christians or not. They might say it's a secular society. They probably would. But in law, it is a Christian country in the sense that the head of state, the Queen, is the head of the Church of England. And the relative religious tolerance that is now practiced is actually a relatively new phenomena in Britain. Go back, 13th century, all Jewish people were expelled from Britain, only allowed back during the Cromwellian era. What was that, 400 years later, in the 17th century. And Catholic religion, the Roman Catholic religion, was outlawed during the Tudor times when Henry VIII effectively nationalised the church and set up the Church of England and attempted to destroy all influences of the then and continuing Holy Roman Empire. And it wasn't until the 19th century that the Catholic Emancipation Act was passed. Indeed, it was only 140 years ago the Catholic Emancipation Act was passed in Britain, and we still have an established church in the Church of England. So the idea that there is a uniform approach to all faiths and all religions, and there is a completely secular society in Britain, may be true in the sense of the thought process of a lot of people, and in a lot of more modern legislation it's certainly there, but at the centre of it there is a special place for the Church of England, which has a very protected status and a great deal of wealth. And whilst there is a recognition and protection for other faiths through taxation and other issues, it is not exactly on the same status as that. Although the Church of England is such a massive and all-embracing organisation and faith, it's very hard to say exactly what the central core thought process is in the Church of England, except accepting the principles of the life of Christ and his teachings. Muslim communities are now very big and very present in Britain, but there's always been a substantial Islamic community in Britain, going back a very long way. The first mosque was, I think, established in Liverpool, but other mosques were established after that. And most of the issues of religious intolerance between different faiths actually are quite easily traced back to the operations of European colonialism and the attempts at imposing a supremacy of a form of Christianity over Islam in the Crusade period, 11th, 12th, 13th century, and the way in which later British and French colonies in particular attempted quite effectively from their point of view divide and rule tactics between different faiths. Thus, South Asia was very easily divided between Hindu and Muslim by promoting one community over the other, one faith over the other, accepting one over the other. The same was done with many other communities. And the levels of intolerance by European religious zealots going around the world were utterly unbelievable. You wouldn't need to read very much into the Spanish/European conquest of the Americas south of the United States to see the unbelievable degree of intolerance that was adopted by people allegedly in the name of Catholicism against people of different traditional faiths, be they Maya, Aztec, Inca, or any other traditional faith that existed in that area. So I think that we need a far better understanding of the history of religious intolerance practiced by a lot of people over a very long period to give us some understanding of where we are at the present time. Which one are you tapping? The 5 or the 2? 5. Oh, 5, that's okay, thank you. You've got to check with these moderators, you never know what they might get up to. So that understanding has to be something that I think should be taught and better understood within our schools. There is a growth of Islamophobia at the present time, and that is nasty, dangerous, unpleasant and wrong. There is also an increase in anti-Semitism. There is also, in some areas of Europe, a general increase in intolerance between different ethnic groups and different faiths and religions. And legislation to deal with this is actually fraught with problems. After 9/11, George Bush then announced that there was going to be this war on terror, and I can only believe that he was very badly taught history, decided to use the word crusade as a way of dealing with the war on terror without having the slightest notion of the concept of what the crusade was actually about. It was a brutal attempt to suppress Islam and take over what was then Constantinople and win back the holy places. He used that, and that then became an open door for an Islamophobia at the street level and the institutional level across Europe, and at the more brutal level of the prosecution of wars across the whole of the Middle East region. That in turn has created a sense of racism within our society, a greater racism within our society, but it's also led to great concerns about the growth of what's termed, Maria was explaining it, Islamic fundamentalism and jihadist forces. And so the British governments have then responded by saying they're going to promote the prevent strategy, which the idea being that you prevent young Muslims from adopting extreme views and extreme positions. I would prefer it if we said there is a national narrative that is against racism and intolerance in any form, from whichever faith or ethnic group it comes, and a much greater promotion of the idea of an inclusive society that doesn't suppress identity, language or faith, but recognises the diversity of it. And the latest anti-terror laws that have gone through Parliament, I think, are fraught with difficulties are going to unravel quite quickly. Because just take the fairly narrow but important example of the way universities are being treated. Universities, on the one hand, are told they must adopt a prevent strategy and report anyone they think is developing extremist tendencies, i.e. jihadist tendencies or whatever particular term you wish to use. The House of Lords then examined this bill that had come from the Commons and concluded that this was damaging to the principles of academic freedom and how universities ought to be able to operate. And 500 professors, that's an awful lot of professors. Imagine 500 professors in one room, all that thought process, imagine it. Frightening, terrible, terrifying. Then penned a letter to The Guardian in which they said this was fraught with difficulty and damaged academic freedom and freedom of speech on campus. And so the Lords then put in various caveats to the law of requiring universities to have an observation and surveillance of their students and the academic body at the same time as protecting free speech and academic independence. I'm not sure the two things actually can work together, because I think if the one hand you're saying you must ban a speaker coming from the university because you believe that speaker might present an extreme point of view, and at the same time saying that you can have, you must protect academic freedom and tolerance, I'm not sure the two things are going to work very well together. So I'll just conclude with this thought. We live in a very much a multicultural, multi-faith society, particularly in the major cities in Britain. We live in a time when there is almost routine abuse of minorities, particularly of Muslim minorities at the present time in Britain. So, for example, it was seen on the news yesterday, or last night rather, as a problem that 1 in 12 children undergoing education in Britain are Muslims. Why is that a problem? Why not say that 6 out of 12 children undergoing education in Britain come from Christian families? Why not say 1 out of 12 children come from Jewish families? Why not say half a child out of 12 come from Buddhist families? But the news about the Muslim background was apparently news and a problem, and that leads to the development of a lot of the so unpleasant in society. So I think we need to do what is practiced in reality, and I'll finish on this point, Ben, in many of our mosques and community centres, and I see Mohammed Kosbar here from Finsbury Park Mosque, in that mosque practices what it preaches every day. It's open doors, open policy, open days, open sessions, open community events, and seriously practices the idea that Muslim is a very important faith, Islam is a very important faith that preaches tolerance and peace, as do others, and they meet together through a faith forum. That's got to be the right thing to do. I'm not in favour of religious laws as such. What I'm in favour is a legal system that protects the right of people to practice their faith, irrespective of what that faith actually is, and allow that degree of toleration within our society rather than oppressing people because of the perceptions of what some people of that particular faith may or may not do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And we've got a time now where there can be a discussion and questions from the floor. If people want to make a point themselves or direct a question to the panelists, feel free. In the interests of sort of time and democracy, let's try and keep the points reasonably brief and the questions too. So just put up your hand if you have a question. Yeah, one lady here. Miranda, go ahead.
Okay. I'm aware that most countries need a scapegoat in order to, if you like, work together. Britain has used scapegoats over the years. At one point it was the Jews, which, as you quite rightly say, it throughout, and it seems to me that it's more important what perception is than facts quite often. It's what the papers like the Mirror and others of that ilk like to portray about immigrants and Islam, that they are basically the problem with our society. And it's how you tackle that perception, because that's not actually about facts, because they're not really interested in the education and learning the facts. It's how you change that perception so that people don't generalise and don't just sort of lump every Muslim together with the most extreme and create, and the same with immigrants, and create a very unreal but rather nasty approach to it all. And then you get nationalistic parties like UKIP coming to the fore.
Anyone want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I think the media plays a really, really central role. I totally agree with you, and unfortunately,
And it comes out again and again and again. I mean, media is not able to contextualise, what we saw. I mean, through Palestine, Israel, and all the Gaza and so on. There's very little attempt to actually to give an understanding of what's actually going on there. But their scope for manoeuvre is limited. They depend on sort of sensationalism. They want to build a story, and they have a problem too. So I'm not sure what we do about that, but I agree with you completely. I mean, it is perception, and it really doesn't represent reality very well at all, and it's quite frustrating.
I'll take the next question. Thanks for anybody up here at the front first, then we go to the back.
Khalid Nadeem, Citation Police Forum. What I'm interested in is, what do you think are the prospects for political Islam in Saudi Arabia and for a liberal strand of thinking of government to come now with a change of king? What does the future hold? And what does the future hold for minorities in Saudi Arabia?
Prospects of a liberal regime in Saudi Arabia. A bit limited, I would say. I'm constantly appalled by issues of human rights in Saudi Arabia. The treatment of prisoners, the treatment of migrant workers, the routine use of the death penalty, and the status of women within the society, and the double standards of the West in relation to Saudi Arabia. We sell a huge amount of arms to Saudi Arabia. We import a great deal of oil from Saudi Arabia, or at least most countries do import a great deal of oil from Saudi Arabia. And there seems to be sort of a level of double standards that's quite unbelievable, where Saudi Arabia is encouraged to intervene in Bahrain and possibly in Yemen, yet at the same time others are condemned for intervening or interfering elsewhere. Is there a prospect of change? Probably, yes, some change, in that the understanding and pressures about human rights in Saudi Arabia are much greater than they ever used to be, and there's a greater understanding about the situation there, and I absolutely hope it to be the case. Every country in the Middle East and the Gulf, particularly the very wealthy Gulf states, have got to face up to the reality of what their economic strength is based on. It's based, yes, on oil, which at the moment there's plenty of, but the price has fallen a great deal, but no doubt will rise again at some point in the future. But it's also based on the appalling treatment of large numbers of migrant workers from India, Pakistan, Philippines, Thailand, Sri Lanka, you name it, who are in effect no better than indentured labourers working there. And it's an abuse of human rights that is, I think, appalling and has to be addressed. And it's up to all of us to address it. And it isn't attacking a faith to address the issue of that kind of abuse anywhere in the world, and we should take those issues up. Is there a prospect for change? Yes, I think there is, and I do think that will actually begin to come about. There is a growth of protest movements within Saudi Arabia. There is a growth of international concerns about it, and indeed there has been some dialogue with. I've met delegations of elected parliamentarians from Saudi Arabia. I wouldn't say it was exactly a meeting of minds, but at least there was a meeting, and it's a way of beginning to put that sort of pressure on. Maria, I don't know if you like that.
I mean, you said it really.
Okay.
Yeah. And I know we had I've got a few hands up now. So I have two at the back. Yeah, I don't mind whoever goes first.
This is to Jabri, and probably when Labour was in government. Abu Hamza was removed from Central Park Mosque many years ago for being extremist, and since then we've probably been hearing a lot about extremist clerics or extremist members of the community, the Muslim community in Britain. But then at the same time we've actually been in dialogue and in open discussion with probably some members of the Muslim Brotherhood, but some of the moderate Muslims as well in this country. My issue is when does the government choose when to have that dialogue with moderate Muslims and have that as consistent approach by the government? Unfortunately, what we see now is there's a great mix between some extreme members of the Muslim community and some of the ones who what seem to be moderate. But nowadays, at this point in time, probably the British public are not really aware who are the moderates and who are extremists. And probably the Conservative government is actually doing the same thing as well. So how can you take that approach? And do you actually have any concrete foundation to that relationship with those moderate Muslims in this country?
So James, I'll take care of the panelists. I might just take a few.
Yeah, that might be
space
easier
for-
actually, yeah.
Everyone who's got a question, just keep their hand up for a second. That's all right. Okay, and we'll just go from the back again, and then we'll take care of see how many we can go through.
Thank you very much. Actually, I'm asked about whether can political Islam live side by side with secularism. I can collect many evidence throughout the Arab world and from the West to evidence my saying yes. The question whether is the secularism itself can live by side political Islam. The problem that secularism in Arab countries and even in the West are getting worse and worse with regard to political Islam. We saw how secular parties in Arab countries lined themselves beside Sisi and the coup, military coup in Egypt throughout the Arab world. You can't tell that there is a national party or a secular party in the Arab world who excluded himself or herself from being beside the coup against Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. So the question actually to be addressed now, whether secularism itself can live side by side with political Islam or not. It's not the question whether political Islam can live, because there's many evidence about this issue.
Thank you very much, sir. For one over here, and then we'll come on to the other side.
Yeah, just my name's Carl, slightly different question for Jeremy really. You touched on the prevent strain that we currently have in the UK, and there's obviously loads of issues involved with that and how universities and the roles that they play. In your opinion, how do you see prevent moving forward within the UK, if at all? And to what extent do you see the role of law enforcement within that kind of strategy towards combating terrorism?
Shall I pause and then take the last two?
Take them all together.
Take them all together. Okay, on this side I think we've got four, so everyone has to be very quick, all right? We'll go from the back forwards.
Great. Thank you very much. Councillor John Mayor. My question is, does the panel agree that is the violent destruction of political Islam through history and in contemporary time that's actually given the rise of the violent formation of the psychology of militarism within the Muslim world that has no nation state, and henceforth the definition of terrorism is very difficult for us now?
Hope you all both got that. Moving forward. Yeah.
If we're discussing whether political Islam and democracy are compatible, I agree with a lot of Jeremy Corbyn's analysis, but not with his conclusion that they were compatible, because history shows very clearly that whenever one religion dominates the behaviour of a particular state, it always does it to the detriment of minority religions and those with none. You can see that in the treatment of Jews in many countries in Europe, right up until the last century. You can see it the Catholics against treating Protestants minorities, Protestants treating Catholic minorities, including in this country, and so on. And in the case of Saudi Arabia is a good example, actually, of political Islam of a different kind. I mean, the biggest problem about liberalising in Saudi Arabia is not so much the royal family, although they are a problem, it's the Wahhabi sect of Islam, which they have to sort of compromise with all the time to try and avoid too much trouble in the country from extremists there. So,
Okay. Thanks very much. David, and then we'll come back to the front row. Yeah.
I think there's another problem here, and that's the problem of Western identity, of secular identity, of something that feels itself constantly under attack, where government is less and less representative, and a whole raft of issues. And I'd like the panel just to address what's been going on in France, where after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, a Muslim identity has been posed as a threat to a Republican identity. They use this word laïcité, which is very vague, but it's armed at the moment, and an awful lot of Muslims are being picked up on the streets, and what's happening in schools is unbelievable.
Okay, here and then here, right, and then you have to give lots of thoughts in a short amount of time. Yeah.
Jonathan Brown. Whether it's Western allies like Sisi or supposed Western enemies like Bashar al-Assad, there seems to be no shortage of leaders, dictators claiming to be secularist, even when there's a lot of evidence that they stoke sectarianism. My question is more about Western politics, and why is there not more attempt to disassociate ourselves from these supposedly secular leaders who will commit all sorts of atrocities that we wouldn't normally want to be associated with?
And then there was, what was the question?
Kate Toohey, Justice and Peace Commission. Just briefly, I'm concerned about the counter-terrorism security bill which was mentioned. It's been fast-tracked through Parliament, and we're going to see the use of citizens who will be targeted, their passports removed, and minority members of our communities, Muslim communities and minority religions, could be targeted, their passports removed, made stateless. And my other concern is that they are going to be able to ask people to leave their communities and live elsewhere, anywhere in the country.
Okay, thanks so much. I'll have to pause there, sorry, that's right, because I've already got a titanic task for the two panellists to, in a couple of 2 or 3 minutes each, attempt to provide some feedback on a lot of complex questions. So I will hand it over to Jeremy to...
Thanks. There's only 10 questions there. 10 questions in 2 minutes is 12 seconds each. Listen, I'll do my best on it in no particular order. The points on the counter-terrorism bill, I only mentioned it briefly because I didn't have a lot of time. It's a very, very serious piece of legislation because it gives the Home Secretary the power to remove nationality. It gives the Home Secretary the power to prevent people leaving the UK if the Home Secretary has reason to believe they're going to, say, Syria to fight with ISIS or whatever force they're supposedly going to fight with. And it also gives the Home Secretary the power to deny people the right to return to the UK, but they can appeal against it. And so I asked the Home Secretary in the debate on Monday how on earth they were supposed to appeal against a denial of return if they were somewhere in Syria at the time, because they can hardly pitch up at Horseferry Road Magistrates Court if it was still there and say, you know, hello, I want the right of return. So presumably it has to be done almost in absentia. I think it's an extremely dangerous piece of legislation because, like all pieces of anti-terror legislation, it has within it a great degree of executive power. Executive power for a political position, i.e. the Home Secretary, to take a judicial decision. And that is a very, very dangerous thing. Surely the whole principle of British law is the separation of political and judicial powers. They're always in danger of being crossed over whenever you get to special courts and special processes, and this anti-terror law does it in spade loads, as indeed others have as well. And so your point is very well made there. There are review processes, and they're going to have to be used and they're going to have to be operated, and there will be no doubt another anti-terror law of some sort in the next Parliament. I've been in debates on almost every anti-terror piece of legislation for the last 30 years, and all of them I approach it from the standpoint of the separation of political and judicial powers and the right of representation, and this idea that the security services and security information should always be placed on a special pedestal where they don't have to reveal themselves in court. I can see that there are occasionally justifications for holding a court session in private. I would never completely rule it out. But I think the idea that you hold a huge arm of the state separate from any kind of judicial oversight is a very, very dangerous precedent altogether, and something that we should be very wary of. On the point about secularist ideas in France, some of the most intolerant people I've ever met in the world have been militant secularists. Unbelievable. I had a discussion with a secularist group in a cafe in Cairo about 3 years ago. I was coming back from Gaza, and I went to meet people in some cafes somewhere fairly near Tahrir Square. And these were people who held a secular view of the world. They held no religious belief at all, and they were quite clear about that. But they were so unbelievably intolerant of anybody's religious view. I was saying, hang on a minute. And I ended up defending every faith there had ever been. I was there for an hour. It took quite a long time. And it turned out they were actually deeply ignorant of most faiths and where they come from. The narrative of most faiths is actually inclusive, is actually peaceful, is actually about a contribution to community rather than taking from community. That is the generality of it. And I think what happened in France has been both frightening, appalling, and quite terrifying in some ways. Obviously, the killing of people at Charlie Hebdo or anywhere else is absolutely and totally wrong. There can be no justification for it. Nobody's defending it. Nobody's supporting it. The response was interesting in that everyone got together and said it's completely wrong. They have to defend the freedom of speech. And then at the same time, there are attacks on mosques in France, of which very little state protection was given. There were hand grenades thrown at a mosque in Le Mans and other places. And whilst there has been protection given to all the Jewish schools in France, no problem with that. If they're under attack, then they should be protected. The same protection should also be offered to any other religious institution or place of worship that's under threat. Throwing a missile at a synagogue is just as bad as throwing a missile at a mosque or vice versa. We have to be absolutely clear about that.
I might have to pause you there, actually, sorry, if that's all right. If it's possible to maybe pick one from the group, so I can go on to Maria.
What an impossible task you've just set me. The point about Abu Hamza and the Finsbury Park Mosque, I've been intimately involved with Finsbury Park Mosque ever since it was built. Indeed, I was there at the laying of the foundation stone of it. I know the place very well. I go there very often. I hold advice bureaus there, and I've got a lot of respect for the people that run it, and they went through a very difficult time during Abu Hamza's reign there. The British government's dialogue with the Muslim community has been patchy, iffy, selective, often divisive. And I guess one of their excuses is that there isn't a formal structure for Muslim faith in Britain in the same way there's a very obvious structure of the Church of England, Roman Catholics, Muslims, Baptists and so on, or Jewish faith. It's all very clear structures. There is no clear structure there. And it seems to me that they're very selective about who they talk to and very selective in their understanding of the way in which particularly young Muslims feel often unemployed, often unrecognised, often routinely stopped and searched by the police, often feeling very angry and very isolated and subject to the kind of routine discredited remarks that used to be made against the black community, used to be made against the Jewish community, used to be made against the Irish community and the travelling community. And it's this sort of routine acceptance that Islamophobia is okay, but nothing else. It's not okay. No phobia is okay. And we have to get that message through. And that is exactly the contribution that I've tried to make in these debates in Parliament, and understanding that we live in a multi-faith, multicultural society where there has to be space for all those faiths and the huge contribution they can all make to a very strong society. Multiculturalism isn't a threat. It's a massive, fantastic opportunity to build a kind of society that can achieve and understand each other rather than oppress and suppress each other.
Just some final remarks from you, Maria.
I don't really have an awful lot to say. I mean, Jeremy's put it very well. Just to go to the question about extremists. These words, but you know, it's often they're often very convenient labels, and they're used, I think, very selectively. And you know, we like to. I mean, we go back again to the media, I think, and the creation of an enemy. And you were saying it becomes somehow acceptable to attack
Islam to build up Islam as the enemy, to demonise Muslims, whoever they are, whether they're moderates or extremists, and whatever that means. And that also goes to the question about terrorism. You know, it's bandied around all the time. What is terrorism? I mean, it's become such a kind of broad term, and you know, we casually attach it to all sorts of groups. I mean, as Tamimi was talking about Hamas, the British government regards it as a terrorist organisation, and he was of course arguing that it certainly isn't. So you know, it all becomes very automatic and selective, and that also applies to, you know, someone asked about dictators, Middle Eastern leaders in the Arab world, and why does this government support them? Again, I mean, it's selective. It supports some of them, and it doesn't support others, and it's politics, really. I mean, I don't really have much else to add, actually.
Okay, thank you very much. I know there's a lot of questions that have come out here. Hopefully there's a lot of food for thought to people to take away with them. I'd like to thank our two distinguished panellists for their contribution, and to everybody who's attended. Just have three very quick announcements before you're free to go. Lunch will be at the Forum restaurant, which is next to the registration desk. If anyone wishes to pray, please go to the Warhol Hall opposite the registration desk. And there's a resumption of the conference at 2 p.m. for breakout sessions. And the ones that we've got at 2 p.m. are panel 1 on the Muslim Brotherhood ideology and the principles of democracy, case studies from Gaza, Tunisia, Egypt and Syria. Panel 2 is examining the principal orientation of the Brotherhood towards violence, extremism and radicalisation. And panel 3 is impact of oppressive measures targeting the Brotherhood globally. So I hope that's all nice and clear.